In the last lesson, we talked about how we have a representative democracy. Well, in order to choose our representatives, we need to decide on how to organize the elections. First, I need to explain a little terminology. When someone's chosen to represent an area, that area is called the riding. The people living in that riding are the constituents, and the people who can vote are known as the electorate. When their representative is chosen, that representative has the permission to sit in the legislative building to be the voice for the people in that riding. In Canada, the National Legislative Building is the House of Commons. This is why we say that that person has won the seat for that riding. Seats in the House of Commons are more important than the number of votes that you get, because while the number of votes you get shows how popular you are, getting the seat equals getting power, because the party with the most seats then gets the loudest voice in the House of Commons, and they get their ideas passed into law. So let's start with our electoral system. First off, most candidates belong to a political party, so the party members are going to have to decide who they want to run as the candidate for their party. The party members will then help that person campaign throughout the riding to get the attention of the voters. On election day, the electorate vote for their chosen candidate. Let's say there's 5 candidates running in that riding. Whichever candidate gets the most votes in that constituency wins and gets the seat in the legislature for that riding. That means for a federal election, they get to represent the people of their area in the House of Commons. But what about the other 4 candidates? Well, since they didn't get the most votes, they get to go back to their regular jobs and wait until the next election to decide if they want to run again. We call this first past the post because, just like in a race, only one person gets past the post or wins. But we're not done yet. Once each riding has voted, we're going to look at which party has the most seats in the House of Commons. The party that has the most candidates elected, or seats, then gets to become the government of Canada, and their leader becomes the Prime Minister. So Canadians don't actually ever vote for our Prime Minister. We vote for a party, and the winning party gets to pick the Prime Minister. The party with the second most seats becomes the official opposition, and the head of their party is called the leader of the opposition. You always want to be in the governing party because that's the group that gets to pass the laws, while all other members of parliament, or MPs, are just there to question the actions of the government. That's why we rarely elect independent candidates. They can't be part of the governing party. One of the biggest concerns we have with first past the post is that it can create artificial majorities, especially in countries that have several political parties. In Canada, we have multiple parties competing for a seat in the House of Commons. Since you only have to get more votes than the next candidate, you can win with less than 50% of the vote. We call that a plurality, since it doesn't have to be a majority to win. Let's look at the chart here. Of course it's fake. Who won the first riding? It's the Liberals with 45%. Now who won the second riding? It's the Alliance Party. Now the Alliance Party was a political party created in the 90s to represent the more conservative ideologies in Western Canada, especially Alberta. So if you look at the percentage vote they got, 75%, that would tell you it's most likely that this riding was in Alberta. What about that third riding? Would you be able to understand that it's in Quebec? Hopefully you'd know that the Bloc Québécois doesn't have candidates running in Western Canada, so this is most likely a Quebec riding. Okay, let's look at the rest of the chart. Who won the remaining ridings? It was the Liberals each time, but only once did the Liberal Party win with a majority, more than 50% of the vote. Yet they got 5 seats, which means if these were the only ridings in Canada, the Liberal Party would have over 70% of the power with actual support from less than 40% of the population. That's an artificial majority. The Liberals have been given more power than what Canadians want them to have because they won ridings with less than 50% of the vote. Confused? That's okay. Most Canadians are. Here's some real election results to show you what happens. Can you see how some parties are getting more power than the popular vote, while other parties that got votes got almost no seats in the House of Commons, which means their supporters aren't getting a voice, and that can lead to voter apathy. The United States also uses first past the post, but they have a different way of determining who gets past that post first. When the nation votes for the president, every eligible citizen gets to vote for their choice of who should be president. But then they've added another step just to make it more complicated. Okay, the real reason is to ensure that low population centers can have a better voice, but it's really strange to those of us who don't use this system. Each state has something called the Electoral College, which is not a school, but a group of people who are assigned to the task of voting for the president for their state. After the entire state has voted for their choice of president, the ballots are counted, and whichever candidate gets the most votes in that state wins all the Electoral College votes. You can see in this image here that each state has a different number of members of the Electoral College because it is based somewhat on population. That's why presidential candidates spend so much time in states like California and Texas to get all those electoral college votes. Because you don't have to win the popular vote to become president, you need to win the electoral college. And there have been 5 presidents who have not won the popular vote, but still got to be the leader of the country anyways, because they won the electoral college in each state. Let me use a real-world example. In the 2000 election of George W. Bush, at first everyone thought Al Gore had won the election because most people in Florida were saying that they'd voted for Gore. But what they didn't realize is they'd voted for the wrong guy, because instead of checking off a box with a golf pencil like we do here in Canada, there was a machine that punched a hole. But do you see how the second hole lines up with the box with Gore's name? People punched that one and ended up voting for Buchanan. That mistake led to George Bush winning Florida, which meant he got all 25 electoral college votes, and that helped him win by 1%. There's another thing to note about the United States. You can see that the Republican and Democratic parties are really the only parties that are getting any significant numbers of votes. That's why we call the US a two-party system. They have a lot more than 2 parties, but if you vote for a third party, your representative has no chance of winning, so it's almost seen as a protest vote. A two-party system doesn't have the problem of artificial majorities like we have, but the serious problem with a two-party system is that the parties will often come to the middle of the ideological spectrum, and that means a lot of other ideological perspectives aren't being represented. Sweden takes a totally different approach. Instead of using first past the post, they use something called proportional representation. The ballots are tallied up and each party gets seats based on the percentage of the vote they got. So if they got 37% of the popular vote, they get 37% of the seats in their legislature, known as the Riksdag. So each party gets a proportion of power based on the proportion of vote, hence the name proportional representation. Many people argue that this is more democratic because it actually represents what the people want. It's also better for minority groups because they're more likely to have their voice heard in government. But of course there are issues with this system as well. Because there's usually a minority government, which is a government with less than 50% of the power, the ruling party is going to have to work with other parties in order to get support for their ideas. That means they may have to compromise some of their political promises to get the support of the other parties to create what we call a coalition. Also, ridings don't get to choose their representatives. In Canada, we vote for a party, but we also look at who the candidate is. With a system based purely on proportional representation, the party gets to choose who will represent the region in Parliament. And minority governments are often unstable, which can lead to elections being called early because the ruling party can't get enough support to pass legislation. And elections are very expensive. Check out Italy's election results. All of those bars represent a different political party. And another concern with this system is that fringe parties can start to get elected, like the 2012 Greek election that saw both communists and fascists getting elected to parliament. Now, there's still one more thing we have to look at when considering elections, and that's making the decision to have either fixed date elections or periodic elections. Every democracy must hold elections periodically because that gives them the legitimacy to rule. But until recently, Canada's parliamentary system was organized so that the Prime Minister could choose when an election should be called. There's instances where it would be out of the Prime Minister's hands, like in the case of a non-confidence vote, but we'll talk about that in the next lesson. So usually the Prime Minister would call an election within every 5 years. But if you were Prime Minister, would you wait till the end of those 5 years? You better not. Canadians hate that because you look like you're being greedy. But if you call an election too early or too often, we also get upset because elections cost millions of dollars. Why would a politician call an early election? Well, if it looks like your opponent's gaining popularity but hasn't passed your party in the opinion polls, you want to call an election to assure that you can win that one, and now that gives you 5 more years to rule the country. So then, what's with fixed date elections? Well, we just need to look at the United States. Their presidential elections are held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November in a year divisible by 4. In other words, at the beginning of November every 4 years. But those election campaigns can go on for so long that people believe that the president really only focuses on governing the country for his first 2 years, and quite frankly, that's even getting shorter. Those extended election campaigns do bring millions of dollars to the economy with all of those billboards, TV ads, and candidates flying around the country, but it also leads to a focus on the election instead of the need to govern. Here in Canada, when we did have periodic elections, there was only a month to campaign, so there wasn't all this time spent on trying to get a vote, but actually doing the job. However, most people do think it is more fair to have a set date in place, instead of allowing the leader in the government to decide when to hold elections, because it's going to be when it's his party's best interest. So what would you choose, fixed date or periodic?